All right, so for question 5, throughout the Old Testament, Second Temple Judaism, and Christian history, we have encountered a fair number of instances in which women occupied positions of authority or have ruled states and participated in wars. How should we view these instances? Is it an endorsement of females in leadership and military positions? Are they the exception from the general rule, or is there something else going on?
Well, yeah. Well, I'd actually say is that there's a problem with the question because there really aren't a lot of examples of women in any kind of ruling capacity in Scripture, Old or New Testament, or for that matter in Byzantine history. They're extreme exceptions there. And some of the exceptions, at least what might be regarded as exceptions, are actually exaggerations, like Deborah, which is the one that stands out most clearly. She's presented as being a ruler, a judge, whereas in fact the being a judge in that day did not involve any kind of formal oath or duties or responsibilities or authority. They didn't command anything. The book of Judges is in Greek is called the book of Kritai, and that word Kritai, judges, that's a cognate of the word critique, and in a sense that's what judges did in the Old Testament. Is they were people who could critique or discern the moral and spiritual aspect of things, and so you went to them for spiritual guidance, and that's what happens. Barak goes to Deborah for guidance. Actually, I think she calls him because, she's a pious woman, and she gives him instructions, and then he goes off and he raises the army and he commands the army and he fights the battle. He doesn't get the credit for the victory because he's afraid, and he asks her to go with him, and that's a very unmanly thing to do, which is interesting. The way the story is told is that because he has not been more manly, the honor for the victory goes to a woman, not Deborah, but Jael, who was a woman who simply murders the Sisera, the king that they're fighting when he flees to her tent. And beyond that, the only woman who really rules in the Old Testament is Athaliah, but she's said to be a very wicked woman indeed, who introduces the worship of Baal among the Israelites, and she's eventually murdered. She's thrown out of the window when she's overthrown. And you don't get that. You very rarely, you don't have any precedent within Holy Scripture for Christians or the people of God having queens, ruling queens, and the Byzantine age is also very rare. The clear preferences for male rulers. If you look at all of the emperors and empresses, the history of the Byzantine Empire, it lasted for over 1,100 years, and in that time, women ruled in their own right as empresses only 7 years. And even if you include women as regents, where they're acting on behalf of their invalid husband or their minor son, it only puts you up over 40 years there, 46 years. And so women ruling as empresses in the Byzantine Empire, for all the time that the Byzantine Empire was in existence, they only ruled for less than 1% of that time, and only acted as regents, if you add that in, for just 4% of the time. So a clear preference for men, recognizing that, sometimes in a fallen world things aren't as they should be, and in order to avoid civil war or a struggle for power, when a ruler dies or when he becomes unable to rule, they would sometimes resort to having a woman take over, the empress, the mother of the heir, take over, or the wife, and yet pretty much everyone recognizes this is really not the way things ought to be. And in fact, we have the words of Michael Psellus from the 11th century. He's a Byzantine historian, and he's writing about an empress in his time who sort of, because she was raised in the purple, as they say, she was raised in the imperial family, but then the males in the line died. She and her sister ended up sort of being honored as empresses, but it was really when one of her sisters, when they were both in a sense made empresses, her sister immediately married a man, and the man actually ruled. And then when the man died, and then her sister died first, and then the man died, this later, the surviving sister, Theodora, ruled for a few months, but then was replaced with a man. And Psellus himself says, everyone agreed that for the Roman Empire to be governed by a woman instead of a man was improper. And even if the people did not think so, it certainly seemed that they did. So it's just obvious that within a Christian understanding of things, with the man as the head of the woman, that obviously the best way to order society, if you're going to mix men and women together, is have the man take the lead there. You cannot carve, there's no basis for carving out an exception other than pragmatism, or just a resort to something that you just have to do, because in the fallen world, you do have to sometimes make pragmatic choices. And in fact, this is something I've written about too, and we'll be speaking about at a conference in Houston next month, mid-February, about how pragmatic the Byzantines were in their politics. They weren't like a lot of modern Westerners who tend to focus on the ideal of government, how things really ought to be. They recognize that when it comes to politics, since it's all about the use of force, well, the use of force can never really be ideal, because it's something that only occurs after the fall. Then sometimes you just have to do what works. And for the sake of peace, they would sometimes resort to having a woman take the leading role. But by and large, whenever they got a chance, they would replace her. All the regents throughout Byzantine history, all the women who served as regent at one time or another, either were replaced, often simply deposed, or they were obliged to marry a man and have the man take over the job. And really, so beyond the Byzantine experience, within the Orthodox experience before the modern age, the only example of a woman really ruling is Queen Tamar of Georgia, and that's a few centuries later. But and it may be because, well, I don't know, maybe there's something about the Georgians. She did rule for quite a while. She's sort of like the Queen Elizabeth of Georgia, the country of Georgia. But again, it's an exception and not the norm. And the reasons for the exception are pretty obvious. It's a political matter. And the reasons for the norm are pretty obvious, and that's theological, scriptural, and patristic, and traditional, well-grounded in history. And so we really cannot make so much of the times when people have to resort to having women in charge. It sometimes is what you need to do. You know, yesterday I was listening to some testimony by Tulsi Gabbard before the Senate there, and cheering her on in a sense. She made so much sense. Was so brave about it. I'd have to say, yeah, that's the kind of woman I would want to rule, because sometimes you just need somebody who really does see the truth and believe in it and is willing to do what's necessary to defend the truth. That's what you end up. And so yes, sometimes we'll have to make that choice. But ideally, no. Ideally, there's an order, and we should all recognize that order and not throw away a principle for the sake of an expedient.